and ended up being at the center of a really significant case that changed history. And we should all remember them. They are certainly remembered in Canada as persons of national historic significance. They are remembered in the United States via a National Park Service Network to Freedom designation, which was prepared by this person, Kimberly Simmons, so Kimberly can talk about that. In Toronto, they are the people after whom the Thornton and Lucie Blackburn Conference Center at George Brown College is named. They have been depicted on the side of a TTC bus. They are the inspiration for this fabulous work of art that I hope we will all go back and take a look at very intently by Charmaine Lurch. But so much of their important contribution to history happened right here in Sandwich, in what's now West Windsor, historic Sandwich town, and yet so few people around here know enough about them. So that's one of the reasons why we're here tonight having this conversation. I don't want to take up all of the time, but I'm going to go ahead and say that after they made their dramatic escape to Detroit and ended up living there for a couple of years, making friends, establishing themselves within the community of people of African descent and those committed to ending slavery, unfortunately, through a series of events, they were recaptured by their former enslavers, agents on behalf of their former enslavers, and were at great risk of being sent back into slavery in the American South. And because of the collaboration and the community spirit and the determination of a group of people with whom they had formed relationships in Detroit who were committed to ending slavery and practicing vigilance to prevent the re-enslavement of people who were in Detroit, they were able to get free through a series of dramatic events, make their way to Sandwich, where one would think that they would live lives of unencumbered freedom, but unfortunately an extradition request made their lives complicated again. They were jailed here and had to await a decision by the Upper Canadian colonial authorities that would change history. I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly to tell us some more.
Well, you've kind of covered most of it. The story, first off, let me add something to that bio that maybe will connect with everybody so they'll know why is she sitting. My name is Kimberly Simmons, and I am a dual citizen of both Canada and the United States because I too, like a few people in this room, is an Underground Railroad descendant. My story, though, why I connect and live between two worlds is because I'm a Watkins. I'm one of the granddaughters. So I kind of, in my DNA, I kind of belong on both sides of the river. So hence this story and the stories that we'll talk about today are fairly important because we're almost sitting in Sandwich, where my family's been for 190 years. Yes, right by that Watkins sign. So with that, where to add? I have served as a visiting scholar at two universities, University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa, Roll Tide, for a week. You wouldn't believe the football world that lives there. And Purdue University, where I resided for another week. And I will tell you that the story of the Underground Railroad in other places is like a fairy tale. It's like a myth. And people, when you mention the words or when you say that, talk about the history, it's like they're reading a book that was made up for television. However, we that live here know we hear those words all the time, all the time. We see it, our monuments, our statues, our us, and the many, many descendants that are here. We live this world, but understand that this world to other people that not necessarily live in this region, and or I would say Niagara is probably in the same boat, really look at what we stand for here, which is freedom and resistance, kind of as a fairy tale. The Blackburns, however, their story in particular resonates with many of us as well. It showcased the story that fits us both, that fits us well, which is resistance. It fits the story of freedom, which is still being told. And I share the Blackburn story for many different reasons. After they arrived on the Canadian side, after a fight, it was the first riot in the city of Detroit, 1833. It goes down in history as the first riot. When Thornton arrived and met up, or he and his wife were reunited. She had made a decision to change her name. The name had became Lucie, and she didn't want anyone calling her Rutha. That was her enslaved name. So though the people on the American side had adopted that, it became a part of her soul once she came to the Canadian side. No longer was she Rutha. That shows resistance in our souls. The story also portrays, even though Canada has always on the American side been reflected as the land of milk and honey, those of us who either live here or visit here often or have it in their DNA, we know that that's not quite the true story. That's not the story. That's the fairy tale. So the Blackburns, to me, when you bring up their story, when you talk about what happened to them, when you talk about the remnants of their lives, they didn't have any children. However, Thornton was the first black cab owner in Canada. There's a famous, where's that picture? At the Royal Ontario Museum. It's a famous picture of a yellow cab, Hanson cab, on York Street, and it's Thornton. It's Thornton Blackburn. See those little remnants that remain from the stories, the yellow cab? The Blackburns suffered 2 years. They were embattled with being the opportunity to being sent back. They battled Michigan's first governor, who at the time was 21, 22. Yes, they called him the boy governor. That's Stevens T. Mason. And why was he so intent on trying to get them to return or have them extradited? Is because his family were slave owners. He was actually made the territorial governor as basically, we consider 21-year-olds boy children, to run a territory because his family was slave owners in Kentucky. And it was in his soul to make sure that this property was sent back. Resistance is what he got. Resistance is what the United States got. This story is our story. The Blackburns resided here for a couple of years and eventually became citizens of Toronto, hence where the cab company was formed. They are, let's see, you've got the site in Toronto, you've got a marker in Amherstburg. Isn't there a marker? Isn't it marker in Amherstburg? Yeah. One in Kentucky. Eventually, on the banks of the Mississippi and Louisville, eventually, and not too distant future, there is going to be a plaque in downtown Detroit. The designation I wrote for the Blackburns is that those of you that go to the Detroit Public Library, and maybe you know where the Skillman Library is, that's behind where Hudson's used to stand. And it's actually the original first branch of the library. That was the site of the Detroit jail. And why was the Detroit jail in smack dab in the middle of downtown Detroit? Well, it actually wasn't downtown. That was the city limits. Gratiot and Grand River, Broadway, was the city limits. And we talk about where you put a jail. Well, you put it usually at the city limits. Well, that was our city limits. Our city has grown quite a bit since then. However, that place has seen many different functions, and eventually will have a plaque. It does have a library standing on the property. And what's so special about it, and I don't necessarily know that when it happened, and this goes to show you how destiny works, there is a statue of Abraham Lincoln that stands on that property, on the triangular green space that's behind the building. And it wasn't put there for Thornton Blackburn. It was just a remembrance of Abraham Lincoln, whom we, of course, think of freedom when we speak his name. So think about how destiny and life, the strings tie together. Because when you see Abraham Lincoln and you talk about the Blackburns, it takes you to the story of freedom, which is who we are. I think that's all I want to say right now.
All right. No, that's good.
That's good?
Yeah. Well,
wait till I get you on Facebook. I'm going to talk about you. You know that.
It brings up another question as far as the impact that the Blackburns have had, locally, nationally, and throughout North America, and what that is. And that's one of the questions, but it actually strikes me because, as you mentioned about being a dual citizen, while I'm not a dual citizen, I'm originally from Detroit, and I've been here for about almost 30 years now. But growing up in Detroit, I never learned about this. I never learned about the Underground Railroad connection. And I went to a black school in Detroit. We learned about things nationally, but not things across the river. So a story like this, what kind of impact does it have, throughout North America and our region? Whichever one of you want to take it. You both look like you want to take it.
Well, the first thing I will say, I'll let Irene. You got the double barrel, the Essex County Black Historical Research Society here, folks. And then you got our board members here. So think about this. We could talk all day. What I will say is I am working and have been for the last 17 years on UNESCO designation for our river because of its heroism and big story tying the freedom and resistance of this region together to celebrate. So there would be no reason if we didn't think this was a big story. And I will tell you, in the 17 years that I've been working, I returned last Tuesday. I was honored to be invited, so was she. She couldn't go, to Ottawa for the Black History Month event, the National Black History Month event. And I was, I think, the only American there, maybe not, maybe one or two others, at Parliament. And I will tell you that everyone there is excited about a UNESCO designation for our story, for our river, which is the story. I wouldn't have been, this is 17 years that I am passionate about. You don't know me, Dorian, but trust me, if you read my Facebook, you will tell.
I read it and I can tell.
So, okay. So UNESCO is very excited about this happening. It gets closer and closer. Canada's all in. I hope all of you are. It's been the hardest part is convincing the American side, and we share a border. But I'll let Irene speak here.
Thank you. If Chantal Drenning Morgan were here tonight, you would really be in trouble. She knows as much about this topic as we do. I mean, my goodness, there are so many threads to this story, right? We think about, why does this matter and what has been the impact? The impact on our understanding of how the Underground Railroad worked is significantly affected by this story. Thornton and Lucie Blackburn couldn't read or write, but when they made their dramatic escape from Louisville in the daylight in 1831, they did so with free papers that someone else had forged for them in case they were stopped and questioned. They boarded a boat. They managed to get all the way up to Detroit. They didn't cross immediately to Upper Canada because they perceived that they had some safety in Detroit, because there was a network of people there who were committed to working together to ensure that people were safe, to ensure that people were thriving, people of African descent who had formerly lived in slavery, and they joined that community and were pretty happy there until this terrible event happened of Thornton being spotted on the street by someone who recognized him from Kentucky. And then there's that whole thread of the story about what happens when the former enslavers send up their agents to get the Blackburns. You know, a lot of us, I think, have the false perception that, if somebody was caught, that was it. There was nothing that would be done. It was very dangerous. It was a very hazardous situation, but there were these strong networks of people working together to ensure that others were living in freedom and could maintain their freedom. And so that first racial uprising that we talk about, that's known as the Blackburn Uprising of 1833, that didn't just happen suddenly, spontaneously outside the courtroom. That happened because of planning and strategizing on the part of what would become the Vigilant Committee, that community of people working together. And so there was this very, very coordinated effort to free Mrs. Blackburn first, which was the really tricky part. It involved a very brave woman named Mrs. Caroline French heading into the jail and actually exchanging clothes with Mrs. Blackburn and allowing Mrs. Blackburn to walk out dressed in her clothes, and not really knowing what the outcome was going to be for her, Mrs. French, as she remained in that jail dressed as Lucy, Rutha as she was known then. And then there's the whole piece about them getting across into Canada. That didn't just happen either. There were people waiting to make that happen, as there were with many of the freedom seekers, in fact. A lot of people made their way up to this region unassisted largely, had to travel largely on their own, determination, courage, critical thinking, decision making, all of that stuff. But once they reached these Detroit River borderlands, there were a lot of people working together to make these crossings happen, to facilitate them, to make sure that people got to safety, at least perceived safety and legal freedom. But then there's the whole piece about them getting arrested and what happened then. We really cannot overestimate the impact of this decision that happened. And neither of us is a lawyer. But what I will say is, there have been numerous legal scholars through the years who have traced Canada's eventual extradition policy as having a major precedent in this case, in the colonial authorities of Upper Canada essentially deciding that we would no longer, or we would just not send people back at the US government's request or at state government's request to face re-enslavement. It was made pretty clear by Thornton in a letter that he dictated in the jail in Sandwich that he understood he was not going to be sent back to face trial along with his wife, that this was just basically a ploy to get them re-enslaved. And the colonial authorities, after they had sort of weighed the options, came to that decision that he was correct, and that we would no longer as a government send people back to be re-enslaved. That didn't mean that there weren't incursions by former enslavers and bounty hunters and so on into Canadian territory to steal people, kidnap them, and take them back. But the Upper Canadian government and eventually the government of Canada West were not going to be sending people back. But some argue that that was actually the beginning of our refugee policy as well. So there are these really lasting impacts. And then when we look at sort of the later lives of the Blackburns, once they decided to move from Essex County up to Toronto, that's a lasting impact too. Not just the fact that they were freedom seekers who lived in freedom and thrived, and that Thornton Blackburn was the very first owner of a cab company, horse and buggy based, of course, in Canadian history, but that they became people of affluence who used their wealth to support other people of African descent, former freedom seekers. They did that by investing in homes that they could rent to formerly enslaved people when they first arrived, so that they had a place to land and to get their acclimation and be able to move on. And they also invested in industries that employed and contributed to the wealth of former freedom seekers. For example, a number of the mills and industries in the Elgin settlement in Buxton. Thornton became very involved in the anti-slavery movement here in Canada. and actually was involved in conventions and meetings that had national significance. So they really did a lot of things that would not have been possible had they been sent back to Kentucky. I do want to add one thing that's really special about their story, though.
Sure,
I know
go ahead.
we don't have much time, but I do want to say, you know, one of my favorite parts of that whole Blackburn story is that Thornton, you know, after he was living in freedom and some degree of prosperity in Toronto, made the decision in 1837 to go back to free his mother, who was still in slavery. I mean, imagine the bravery that would lead someone to take that kind of risk to free their mom that they hadn't seen since childhood. He literally had not seen his mother since he was a child. He went back and found her and brought her, and she spent the rest of her life in Toronto.
That's true. Let me add something to that. That's a very interesting point you just made. It has happened in other cases too. I'll bring up the Bibbs. Henry Bibbs, the great Henry Bibbs. Do you know he was only 34 years old when he died? Oh my gosh. You know what? There's some of us that can live a really big life. Martin King was 34, I think, 39.
Yeah.
Some of us live our life big in very short pieces of time. Mr. Bibb went back twice looking for his wife, and he had married in Kentucky, and couldn't find her. Probably, I would wager to guess, he married Mary. However, I would say that had he lived a little while longer, he probably would have gone to look again, you know? I mean, that's something, you're looking for a loved one, and you want to make sure that they're safe. But these stories that you hear, they're almost, I get very angry, actually. I didn't watch, let's see, there's been the Underground Railroad was a series, and then there was, what was the BET story? There's been several series that dwell on the Underground Railroad. And I get asked, well, did you see it? Did you watch it? What'd you think? Here's the story. Well, here's the thing. They make up the stories. Well, why would you have to make up a story about this subject? There's no reason to make up a story. The real story itself is incredible. And as Irene mentioned earlier, most of the escapes of approximately 100,000, that was all, still a lot of people, 5 million enslaved though, but around 100,000 people is what we estimate used the Underground Railroad network. There are the stories that you hear, and there are stories that are being uncovered, but there's 100,000 of these stories to tell. Most of them self-emancipating. And can you imagine some of the stories that we don't know, besides the ones that we know? The Blackburns are a story that has been researched by one single woman for 30 years. Her name is Irene Moore Davis. Excuse me, that's you. Everybody's got these three names, you know. Carolyn Smarts Frost. Excuse me, please don't tell her. I'll be dead. Okay. Trust me on this one. But she is the co-editor of our collaborative issue volume, which is called A Fluid Frontier, published by Wayne State in 2016, that Dorian mentioned earlier. It's a special volume. It's 12 authors, 6 American, 6 Canadian, telling these stories. And Mr. Bibbs is one. My family's another. The Blackburns. And there are many. But if you note, as Irene described these stories, a lot of them are very similar. They're separate but similar. It's always about freedom. It's the perseverance. It's always about looking back. Family, what am I going to do? Should I go back for them? I will go back. It's about working together, because that was the only way we were going to get where we're going. The mythology that surrounds the Underground Railroad is what, when I see these stories that are made up on TV, I'm thinking, why are they making this story? This is ridiculous. The best one was the Underground Railroad, where they were all escaping together. That had never happened. Never. Never. They all would have been caught, hung, or whatever else would have been done to them. Never. Oh, we're going to do a pack escape. No, that doesn't happen like that. The fact that we even can celebrate some of them still is surprising to me, and should be surprising to all of you. But I just wanted to add that there was that addition, because the bibs, there's probably a few other stories I can't think of off the top of my head. Mr. Henson, the great Josiah Henson. And all of these people that we're discussing today, this story, I don't know if you guys know. We've heard today, I missed that, late tunnel bus, but Irene did a tour, and there's a stamp, a life-size stamp of Mary Ann, and that was debuted, 3 weeks ago now? But in case you hadn't heard, I will tell you now, it's been announced, March the 9th, the United States Post Office is actually creating, or has created, they will be issued on the 9th of March, an Underground Railroad stamp collection. 10 figures, 10. Out of the Underground Railroad heroes. And actually, to me, I am a descendant, so I might be a little biased, but no, there should be 100,000 stamps of everyone. But there will be 10 stamps initiated. And yes, we do have our usuals, Mr. Douglas and Ms. Tubman. However, there's one person that's going to be placed on a stamp. His name is William Lambert. And if you have never heard of him, you should. William Lambert was the man in these parts. The Detroit Vigilant Committee, he was founder. He was the station master at Second Baptist Church in Detroit, which is in Greektown, which is the sister church to Sandwich Baptist Church in Sandwich, founded by the same pastor, the same congregation. You have the opportunity to celebrate him because you're celebrating our region, and I think that would be a fabulous opportunity to get the stamps, because there are 10 of them, and I just named 3. There's a couple others that are from Michigan, but I don't know. Dorian, I think I'm running out of that.
That's good. It's fascinating and engrossing. And actually, as you two have talked, you've kind of cleared out a couple of our questions already, so that's good.
Well, just let us talk some more. We'll just talk. You can just tick them off.
Don't worry, I'm going to give you that opportunity. Okay. Don't worry. But I want to change the subject to what do we learn from this, and how do we take it into the future, and how can knowledge of history help with enacting social change in our communities? And I think that's something that you two are passionate about. So how can this knowledge help to do that?
I think it's really important that we value and truly understand and learn about our Black history. I mean, I think we need to know about all the history, but Black history specifically is so important, not just in this region, but nationally and internationally. I mean, it's so fascinating to me. I think it was early last week that I was literally going around this area with a film crew from the Netherlands that were preparing a show called Hidden Trails that's about the Underground Railroad. So in the Netherlands, they sent over a film crew from their public TV to learn all about our history. They had already done extensive research, and they had been going up and down all kinds of Underground Railroad sites, and they knew a lot and wanted to film it and ask questions. And I was really floored by that, in the sense that there are people who make it all the way through the education system here who don't know the stories that this film crew from the Netherlands knew. Do you know what I mean? Like, we've really got to work on that. I was so excited to see last week the announcement of the Ontario curriculum being updated so that kids will be learning about Black history more intentionally through mandatory curriculum in the social sciences starting in fall 2025. That's a good move, but we have to stay on top of it and make sure that those stories are told well and accurately, and that they reflect all of the regions of this province and of this country, and that people will get the right messages out of that. I think that for young people in particular, for all of us, but especially for young people, you know, the absence of our faces and names and facts from the history textbooks and from what people have had access to generally, has had a lot of really negative impacts in terms of people's understanding of how people of African descent fit into this country when we in fact showed up, what our contributions have or have not been. And I think it leads to, sort of the perpetuation of white supremacy in the school system and just our understanding of who's a contributor in society and who's not, who's added something, who has been subtracting, all of that stuff. And I think that we need to see a lot more of that discussion. But for us around here, specifically, I think we need to be celebrating our history for a variety of reasons. This place was the epicenter of the Underground Railroad. I mean, it really was so significant. And for us not to value that history is really a shame. There's a reason why the Canadian Federal Historic Plaque about the Underground Railroad is located here in Windsor on the base of the Tower of Freedom Monument. And it's not just because that was a cool place to put it or because it was easiest to put it there. It's because this region was so significant. And we all have so much to learn from that. And I think we all have to be very mindful of the fact that, that was just sort of the beginning of a lot of struggle that people of African descent went through in this region that have actually contributed to the rights and freedoms that we all enjoy and for which this country is known. So I think those are important lessons for all of us to grasp. And I think that there is just endless inspiration to be taken from these stories that we in our time can do so much better in terms of moving the needle on social justice, racial justice, every form of justice, if our ancestors in fact were able to accomplish all these things with much greater difficulties and obstacles. Kimberly.
Well, let me, you can answer that, but I want to add this one other question on there. What other either person or events in history are still underappreciated in our community or under-recognized in our community? So if you could add that to your answer to this question.
Well, let me just piggyback on the education piece.
Mm-hmm.
I run officially the Detroit River Project. I'm the executive director and founding president. And yes, our centerpiece mission is to acquire UNESCO World Heritage designation for our river. However, there are other initiatives that surround that mission. When you are trying to build a portfolio for a UNESCO designation, you have to kind of show there's other things. There's reasons for wanting that. And we have accomplished through a partnership with the University of Michigan. Our subcommittee chair, educational chair, is sick today, home. That's Chantel Browning Morgan. But we, during lockdown, we were kind of busy. And we actually created a curriculum. It is geared to 7th and 8th graders. 7th grade is where Canadian kids get their local history. 8th is American kids. We created a curriculum. It's called Along the Fluid Frontier, the Detroit River Project International Heritage Curriculum. Now, what's so special about that? It's a 10 case study curriculum. And actually it's being used at the University of Windsor for undergrad students are actually using that to create a class project for a class. Dr. Greg French's class, he created an opportunity for us to engage. It's being used at the University of Michigan sporadically. But what's so special about the curriculum is the fact that it is intended to have 7th and 8th graders from both countries at the same time actually learn the 10 case studies by lesson plans and action and projects at the end of the semester. It's semester long, and do it together, because our history in this region is the same history. It mirrors each other from one side of the river to the other. And our children need to learn their story. This is their story. They are living this story. They exist in this place. So the quest is to have at some time 2 7th graders, one in Detroit and one in Windsor, actually across border virtually, working a lesson plan, maybe helping each other get through the lesson plan and sharing it with each other and their teachers. It is the only curriculum like it, the only learning experience like it in the world. And it's here. We are currently in 6 school districts, 3 on the Canadian side, both Windsor school boards, Catholic and public. Lambton Kent has it. When we piloted a year ago, we had roughly about 500 kids. Next, I am very happy to say that in September, the Detroit public school system, even though it's been sporadically used in Detroit schools, but in September, new semester, the 8th grade, which is where it belongs, in the 8th grade. 8th grade in Detroit public schools is going to run the curriculum for the semester. So now instead of talking about 700 kids, now we're talking about 50,000 kids that'll get to know this story, which is their story. So as we talk about expanding the Canadian understanding of Black history, we've got this other reinforcement behind it, talking about specific history, but let's be clear, the story of freedom and resistance is our story. So this is our story to tell. So we've got that kind of tied together. And I wanted to add, there's another piece that we don't speak of, and Irene kind of touched on it, and I said I needed to. There is such a thing as the National Underground Railroad bicycle route. How many of you know this? It's been in existence since 2009. I happen to sit on the National Advisory Board for it. I was helped in creating what is called the Detroit Spur. 538 miles of that journey from Mobile, Alabama to Nova Scotia is literally the Detroit story. It's the way to Detroit and to the river and across. So there are sites all across from Mobile, Alabama, all the way to Nova Scotia that touch on our stories along the way. You can bike it, and of course you can ride part of it. That tied to your question about the other stories, there are stories to tell all over our country, east, west, north, south, in our country, and then in Canada, that somehow sometimes don't get those that as much bravo as Mr. Douglas. Hail to Mr. Douglas, and hail to Ms. Tubman. Absolutely. But I tell people all the time as I'm talking, if they were the only 2 people doing any work, we'd still be down there pulling some cotton off of a plant somewhere in the South. So that's just not happening.
So that's what you've all just been saying kind of goes to another question that's here that you don't have to answer because you are the answer. And the question is, how are the Blackburns remembered, honored, and celebrated today?
And tradition policy that we have discussed that is because of them. But I would probably disagree with you very much to single out the Blackburns as who should have a monument. The reason why the Tower of Freedom is anonymous, all those stories are important. Every single one of them. Did you know Mr. Lambert, who's on the stamp?
Yeah.
Mr. Lambert helped fund Harper's Ferry. You are aware of that.
So, and
That's a really big story.
In a probability, there's another gentleman that's forgotten. It's a Mr. DeBattista.
He's not forgotten. He is the man that's pointing on the monument on the Detroit
I
side.
realize that.
So he's not, trust me, Mr. DeBaptiste, his descendants wouldn't allow.
We're trying to get an earful of these people and their names.
And as I said, we can agree to disagree. But there are a lot of stories.
All right.
A lot. And that's why Mr. Dwight, when he created the monuments, there's only one person that you can single out and say that is who that is, and that's Mr. DeBaptiste. Everyone else is quote unquote anonymous intentionally, because all these stories, you have Mr. Henson, we could go on. There's many. So I just say that the Blackburns live in 500-page book that one was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and New York Times bestseller list, and I've Got a Home in Gloryland, Carolyn's book. So they also live in the extradition policy. However, I don't know that they necessarily should be singled out, because there is Mr. Bibbs. He lived a big life in 34 years. So there's a lot of stories, and the Blackburns have their home site in Toronto is a National Historic Site. They are nationally significant persons of Canada, and so on and so on.
But wiping,
so
but wiping out these here in Windsor is a disservice to everybody here in the city that literally wants to understand our history.
I'm gonna step in here.
Might look
sir.
a little pale to you,
Can you let
but
the experts
this is
speak?
history.
Thank you.
Excuse me.
I'd rather listen to the experts.
Yeah. We're getting past our time here, but are there any other questions for our panelists?
Question? I'm not from the area, so a lot of this information is completely new history to me. If there are other sites or other locations that ignorant folks such as myself should be checking out, what would you suggest?
Oh my goodness, that's a wonderful question. Like to learn about the Blackburn specifically, or just all about, oh my goodness.
What top one for each of you, I guess?
Oh my goodness, that's really hard. Sandwich First Baptist Church is a place that you should visit, but so is the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. I can't do just one, I'm sorry. I want to say the Josiah Henson Museum of African Canadian History in Dresden, the Chatham Kent Black History Society and Black Mecca Museum in Chatham. I've mentioned the Amherstburg Freedom Museum, the Buxton National Historic Site and Museum in North Buxton. Those are all important places to visit, but make use of well-curated, well-researched web resources too, like the Across the River to Freedom website, like the Amherstburg Freedom Museum website, like the Ontario Archives of Ontario Alvin McCurdy collection, and certainly written resources like A Fluid Frontier, Slavery Resistance, and the Underground Railroad and the Detroit River Borderlands, co-written by 14 brilliant people. Chapter 4 is really killer, I have to tell you.
I think it's chapter 8, but hey, I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.